Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Thursday, April the 23rd. It must feel to number 10 like some things never end. 8 months after the sacking of Peter Mandelson, we've got yet another committee hearing into Keir Starmer's appointment of the ambassador to Washington, with weeks more of all of this to go. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. On the subject of problems without end, overnight the US says there is no time frame on ending the war with Iran, as Tehran says that reopening the Straits of Hormuz is not possible. So shortages arising from that do seem to be looming. Airlines on the continent warning of jet fuel shortages in the next weeks and going into the summer holidays. The British government trying to play it chill on that one, saying that all is manageable.
Can I make a really... I think this is such an obvious point to be naive. So it's absolutely fine. It's great if the UK have enough jet fuel. But what happens when planes go abroad to the continent where there's not enough jet fuel? What happens to all the flights then? So it's absolutely fine for the British government to say supplies are fine in this country till they're blue in the face. That doesn't mean air travel is fine if there ain't the fuel to refuel when you land in your European holiday destination.
Anyone who has deeper knowledge of this issue of airline fuel contingencies than me should get in touch with the podcast post haste to reply to Sam Coates' very good challenge there. I'm going to stick to my very basic skill set and say that with the Scottish Welsh local elections only 2 weeks away, Keir Starmer really can't catch a break. We went into that yesterday, Sam, the cabinet concerns over the handling of the Mandelson affair. And you just had to listen to the interviews, including that extraordinary one with your colleague Sophie Ridge on Sky with Pat McFadden yesterday, to feel that awkwardness about backing up Keir Starmer and kind of on what ground those around him are supposed to defend him, because they seem to sort of take slightly different angles on that. Well, this morning, Rachel Reeves and Shabana Mahmood added to the list of those who clearly have some reservations about the way the Prime Minister has been responding in the Ollie Robbins affair.
And if you remember yesterday, the New Statesman named Shabana Mahmood, Ed Miliband and Wes Streeting as amongst those cabinet ministers that basically think Keir Starmer is finished. In the last 24 hours, nobody scrambled to correct the record on that. Although I see that Shabana Mahmood is doing interviews as part of her refreshed France small boats deal later today. So hopefully she'll get questions on that. So let's see how she handles that. Talking of frustration and anger, I can tell you from multiple different directions. Bits of the civil service are in a state of collective rage about the way it's all being handled, including, interestingly, by the new head of the civil service, Antonia Romeo, who seems to have added accelerant to the whole thing as far as people can see and most people believe. This sort of hyper-aggressive, but ultimately maybe self-defeating fight and manner of a fight against Ollie Robbins. I'm getting phrases like beyond furious amongst Mandarins. And I have to say, there's even consternation about the fact of a big Mandarin appearance this morning.
Fun fact, if you go into the Cabinet Office, they've got one of those things where you're revolving big kind of trying to be quite sort of technologically enabled things that shows you different pictures of aspects of the work of the Cabinet Office. And there's a really big one of a very smiling, very confident Antonia Romeo, which says, "Welcome, Antonia." I'm not sure whether that probably needs someone to guard it in case anyone defaces it with a Sharpie at the moment. Daybook reflecting today a very tentative sense of support within the cabinet and the number of voices effectively telling the Prime Minister to cool it on attacking the civil service. So I heard from one minister in attendance, we don't want to end up in a ministers versus the blob sort of Dom Cummings world here, referring, of course, to those terrible relations between Boris Johnson's administration, particularly Cummings as the main driver of that and critic of the civil service. Shabana Mahmood reportedly asking if Robbins was so great an official, why was it necessary to sack him? And this charge that Starmer had a bit of a rush of blood to the head at the end of last week, as opposed to finding a way to raise the issues with him of why he hadn't been given that vetting information, which he's sticking to his guns, the Prime Minister saying he should have had, and that Robbins was to blame. Was there another way of raising it without firing him and then all the questions coming out afterwards? And that has led to a perception that there's a danger, and I think this is what was playing out in cabinet, that he just dislikes officials full stop. It struck me in retrospect, as the best ideas do on a podcast, that Darren Jones, when I interviewed him, Sam, in the midweek, was very keen to say how important civil service is to his big project, remaking the state, using AI, modernising government, etc. There was one senior official texting me afterwards, the government certainly got a funny way of showing its gratitude. In the Soviet Union, used to say the beatings would continue until morale improves.
It's really interesting, this business of was there a rush of blood to the head, because the government's case, Keir Starmer's case against Ollie Robbins, has got more and more complicated, and I defy almost any listener to even this podcast, which is for the most involved in politics, to follow the thread that that is being threaded through the eye of the needle in order to keep all the bits of their argument on side. I was listening to PMQs yesterday to Keir Starmer, and one bit leapt out and it slightly blew my brain, and it's where Keir Starmer was making the case that Ollie Robbins did the wrong thing, but nevertheless followed due process. Right, that's right. He did the right things by the rule book, but there was the wrong outcome, so they fired him. Now, if you just take that bit in isolation, and I know Number 10 would argue that you can't take that bit in isolation. I'm just looking at the Employment Tribunal, right? So you've got the Prime Minister saying he did the right thing, but should have known to do different. Well, if he did the right thing, I think in employment law there wasn't a problem. What was the case for dismissal? And I wonder as they try to, and we'll look at the Tory attacks on all of this in a bit, because clearly the way the Tories are coming at Keir Starmer is conditioning some of his argument. But in trying to defend himself in one place, it feels like he's getting himself tied up in knots in others. So the point at which the Prime Minister is going, Ollie Robbins did all the right things, but I had to sack him anyway, but apparently without asking him in advance what his case for the defence was. This all feels just like a very problematic place to have ended up. Anyway, maybe there'll be a little bit of clarity when another big Mandarin, who's very much been on the Prime Minister's side, comes before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee this morning.
Yes, Kat Little should be able to give us some clues as to what's coming in the next round of disclosures in the Mandelson files, after my colleague Dan Bloom revealed earlier this week with Sam Blewett that it might be more limited than first thought. For instance, text messages from ministers to Peter Mandelson. Will they be in scope? What will then be ruled out? And there did seem to be a bit of backsliding danger on that. And that's in the news today, because the Spectator's Tim Shipman, always a reliable drop, the Shipman, big read of the piece. He sent details of two messages Starmer sent Mandelson, a text before the night he made the announcement of his appointment to Washington. So before the vetting in question was carried out, saying, "You'll be brilliant in challenging circumstances. After many years of our discussions, we get to work together side by side. I really look forward to that." It's also reported by Tim Shipman that Darren Jones sent Mandelson a warm missive. Now, that, particularly the Starmer message there, does rather blow a hole in the narrative that we've been switched onto, really, that it was all kind of Morgan McSweeney who teed up Peter Mandelson for this job, that Starmer didn't even personally particularly want him or have close contact with him. We were told that they didn't speak before Peter Mandelson headed off there over to Washington. But what about that thing saying, after many years of our discussions? Puzzled face.
Well, we might get quite a lot of answers to all of this when Morgan McSweeney appears before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which we are told is happening on Tuesday. I'll slightly believe it when I see it, but that seems to be the expectation at the moment. There's a little bit involving the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and Morgan McSweeney that I just want to pick up on. I want to shed a bit of light on one of the more curious things that actually happened to me this week. And it was in the light of the Ollie Robbins Foreign Affairs Select Committee hearing on Tuesday, because I was heading to work and all of a sudden my phone completely lit up after the Liberal Democrat MP on the committee, Richard Ford, said this.
Going back to the point where Sir Philip was still permanent Undersecretary, it is reported by, I think it's Sam Coates, that the Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff, rang Sir Philip and said, in terms stronger than those that I can use before the watershed.
I think you should.
Well, I'll just say that it was just to prove it with terms stronger than that. Does that accord with your impression?
Just prove it.
Does it accord with your impression when you took over from Sir Philip?
I think I recall Philip saying to me, certainly Philip's handover to me has contributed to my strong sense that there was an atmosphere of pressure and a certain dismissiveness.
So you heard the Ford point and Ollie Robbins' reply there. And look, I was asked on air about, that exchange, and I kind of mumbled. It's always nice to be mentioned in the House of Commons and to kind of change the subject, because there was something a bit weird going on. Because here's the thing, Anne, that thing that the Liberal Democrat MP was quoting from me, I never actually reported it. I'd heard it as a rumour. I made lots of calls to see whether it was true. But I'd come up against a denial, and it never actually made it into the public domain. I was phoning people about it and discussing it with them, but there isn't any platform on which I formally reported it or informally reported it. There were absolutely key calls for certain between Number 10 and the Foreign Office, as Robbins indicated, as you just heard. But the thing that gets the specific denial is the swearing by McSweeney at Philip Barton, and that's not. And I haven't had people particularly challenge that still this morning, and that continues to be denied. So in this sort of topsy-turvy world of Westminster, I spent Tuesday being congratulated and slightly going viral for a phantom report I didn't do and didn't think was quite true. How did it happen? I think it's all basically a bit of harmless Chinese whispers rather than anything else. And I'd invite any MP, if they want to champion the reporting that we've done on this podcast or elsewhere this week in the Commons, then great. But I think the committee is actually going to quietly rewrite the record. But the real substantive question is, what did Morgan McSweeney do or not do on the phone to Foreign Office officials? And luckily, Emily Thornberry is definitely the person to get that out of him on Tuesday, if anyone can get to the bottom of it.
Two quick thoughts on Emily Thornberry and her delivery. I've always thought she sounds like it's a RADA graduate. She does have a lot of people, I think, who have quite enjoyed her performances with Week. It's this sort of mixture of her ocean going serious, but a bit of I'm on the stage now.
She was at the theatre last night. Would you know?
Was she?
Would you believe?
Was
She's a fan of the fan of the boards.
Yet that does not surprise me, given her delivery. She knows, doesn't she, how just to leave that little split second timing, which really puts the boot in. But I'm also really loving the mysterious case of the Sam Coates story that didn't bark in the night time. It's like they know what you're thinking, Sam, even before you report it. It just shows how horribly assiduous you are.
Oh, that's embarrassingly kind. Right, and I think we should just hop over to the way opposition parties, particularly the Tories, have been dealing with this crisis. The Liberal Democrats first, and now the Tories are sort of sniffing around whether or not it's possible to try and do a Boris Johnson to Keir Starmer. In other words, refer him to the Privileges Committee for an investigation. That seems to be their latest tactic. But listening to Kemi Badenoch in the Commons yesterday, I didn't think she quite landed the blows that she could have done in the Commons chamber. And it's interesting, I think a lot of people would think that there's an open goal here for opposition parties, but somehow there have been two big parliamentary moments this week in the Commons chamber, and neither of the opposition attacks have been the thing that you remember.
Yeah, it's still quite challenging, I think, for the opposition this sort of knowing which of the many balls which are on this field of play to pursue and which ones to give a good kicking to and which not. So I think the Starmer claim that no pressure existed whatsoever in his dealings with Ollie Robbins and further with the Foreign Office, bringing in that possible Matthew Doyle appointment to a diplomatic sinecure. I think that's been, that is well highlighted by Kemi Badenoch, because it's sort of obvious that constant pressure of some sort was applied, and it's really just about how you judge that and how important was it in the great scheme of things. Notably, though, Badenoch hasn't been repeating her line that Starmer lied to save his skin, that kind of language, which amps it up to the next level. Maybe because it's easier and you get more people on board by making the case that this pressure was applied, which most people can kind of follow and agree with. But it will be quite interesting whether she gets some succor there when we get Morgan McSweeney's evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee whenever that comes, because it plays to her case, doesn't it?
It does, completely. I'm interested in your view as well, as a seasoned Kemi listener and Tory watcher. A couple of days ago, you were talking more generally about the Tory party, its robustness and possible shadow cabinet moves. And if you can never speculate on a cabinet or shadow cabinet reshuffle without lots of people getting very enthusiastic to have their say. What have you picked up since you entered those choppy waters on Tuesday?
Well, indeed, the rumours I was picking up, along with some others who were reporting this in fairness, of plans being drawn up for a reshuffle of some of the top front benches. Yes, that has been a bit of a cat among the pigeons. A Kemi spokesperson got in touch to tell me very firmly this was not in the offing, that she was happy with how her team is, quote, taking the fight to Labour. No changes were planned. Also an ally of Mel Stride, saying of the Shadow Chancellor, he's not going anywhere, and citing Mel Stride's 30 years of business experience, drawing a contrast in quite amusing terms with Robert Jenrick, the newbie in the Treasury brief at Reform after 8 years as a junior solicitor. Okay. Possibly a bit more than that, but and also saying Rachel Reeves not exactly covering herself in glory either. So they were suggesting that this is a more solid front bench, and it's fair enough to reflect that pushback. At the same time, there are those who have been advising Badenoch and pushing hard for a change in the lineup at some point, and the intention, Sam, is to bring on those younger Tory stars. Claire Coutinho is very strongly mentioned there, and so I did check in, because sure, check if you've sort of over-egged something, but a very prominent front bencher put it to me like this: well, yes, we could do a reshuffle on the kind of logic a lot of people, and I think donors are saying that they need to move on through the generations, refresh. But the present events and the impact that's going to have on May the 7th on the elections do make it better to let Labour stew in the gloom there. Don't bring attention back to Tory power battles, because there's never such a thing, this person said, as a veteran of these things, of a reshuffle. There's always some collateral damage. So on that reading, Badenoch can choose her time, and with Jenrick gone, her job is safe. So no fear, no favours. That's the pushback from Planet Kemi. Let's see how it plays out.
I think that the reason that there's going to be some focus on the Tories after May the 7th, and why there'll be questions for Kemi, even if the focus of the story is Labour, is because looking at all of the polling yesterday that was produced for us by YouGov, one of the big stories, I think, will be this set of elections providing evidence that the Tories and Reform are still duking it out and spending a lot of resource and harming each other's ability to win in areas because they're dragging down the vote on the right. And I think that will prompt fresh questions about whether or not this hardcore separation that Kemi Badenoch preaches isn't doing electoral damage. There isn't in this upcoming set of elections absolute evidence that the Kemi approach is causing difficulty.
Can I just chip in on that though, Sam? I was minded to think similarly, but just talking to Reform people in the last couple of weeks, there is zero appetite now for any form of tie-up there, and even to the point of senior people there saying to me, if I brought in someone to cross the floor tomorrow, I don't necessarily think Nigel Farage would want them. So is this the fight on the right, which is going to happen? Yeah, regardless of the evidence, if you see what I mean.
Moods go up, moods go down, but electoral facts, I think, will nevertheless present themselves as the two parties on the right allowing parties on the left to sneak up and triumph. And however much Reform might think they have no interest in this, however much the Tories may insist that a distinctive identity is very, very important, when presented with moments like May the 6th, 7th, it's quite hard to sort of it forces the conversation to happen again. And with that, maybe a reshuffle soon after. Let's see. Brilliant. Well, that draws to a close a sort of incredible week that I have to say was the whole sequence, sludge of events of the last 8 days really was not on my bingo card of where we would be at this point in politics at all. Who knows where we'll be by Monday when we're back. I look forward to seeing you there now.
It's a white hall for us, isn't it? But it's got some pretty serious dangling wires.